Welcome to Chapter 11. In this chapter, we are going to be covering eating disorders. Now, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there are several eating disorders. Included in these eating disorders are things like rumination, where a person is basically vomiting what they've eaten into their own mouths and then re-eating it, kind of like a cow that's chewing its cud. And there's also things like pica, where a person is eating non-food items. Now, those two disorders tend to be much more common in people with learning or intellectual disabilities. Uh, but we are going, in this video and in this chapter, in this class, focus on the three primary eating disorders that we see most often. Those are specifically anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. And as we've done in multiple other chapters, we're going to start with a description of each disorder, then we're going to cover the etiology of the disorders, and finally we're going to end with the treatment of these disorders. But to get you thinking and to start this out, what I would like to do is go to this quick video where we are going to see some of the warning signs that someone might have an eating disorder. So just kind of watch this and pay attention, because I feel like it will get us thinking about eating disorders really well, but it will also help us identify if we have a loved one who might be struggling with an eating disorder, so we can refer them to get the proper services. Here we go. Oh, sorry. Here we go.
Recovery is real. Help is available.
Although there are recognizable warning signs, what you're really looking for is change. Change in attitudes or behaviors related to food, size, weight, really about their self-perception.
Withdrawal from usual social activities, including avoiding eating with others.
Food rituals, such as cutting food into very small pieces or chewing each bite an unusually large number of times, or eating very slowly.
Frequent checking in the mirror for perceived flaws, obsessing over shape and weight.
Negative or distorted self-image or self-esteem tied to appearance.
Hoarding and hiding food.
Eating in secret.
Excessive exercising, and exercising even when you're ill or injured.
Disappearing after eating, often to the bathroom.
Extreme interest in bad diets known as clean eating, or cutting out entire food groups, for example, vegetarianism, veganism, no sugar, no carbs, no dairy.
Changes in personality, such as mood swings, irritability, depression, or lack of emotion.
With binge eating, you're going to find large amounts of food disappearing in short periods of time. People are going to be hiding these containers and these wrappers underneath their bed or in couch cushions out of shame and guilt about what they've been doing.
One of the things that happens when someone struggles with an eating disorder is that their whole GI system tends to slow down. Things like constipation, acid reflux, things like that. Most of these have to do purely and simply with malnutrition and restricted eating. This is an additional level of struggle and distress that it's really hard to help people navigate.
Today, I can say that I'm fully recovered from my eating disorder. Don't ignore the problem. Eating disorders are serious, life-threatening illnesses, and the sooner someone gets help, the better their chances are at full recovery.
Okay. So we're going to start off with a description of anorexia nervosa. So anorexia nervosa, when we look in the DSM, there are three primary criteria to diagnose someone with anorexia nervosa. The first is that they are restricting food that's leading to a low body weight, specifically a body mass index of less than 18.5. Remember, a normal BMI is between that 18.5 up to 25 range. And you can see that in your textbooks if you want to on page 328. And so part of this BMI bit that's really important to remember is that some people just have natural variance. So I have a son right now who, no matter, he eats like a horse, and his body mass index, I'm sure, no question about it, would be below 18.5 for sure right now. And I mean, the kid is super tall. He's going through that growth spurt that boys do, and he's what? My son's 12 years old right now, and he's grown 4 inches in the last 6 months. So he's growing like a weed, and he's always been super skinny, and he's still super skinny. That is not bulimia nervosa, because he's in no way restricting what he eats. In fact, if anything, he's binging. Not just, I say that tongue in cheek. Binging is a serious problem as well, but he's eating a ton. So the BMI isn't everything, but it has to be in combination with this restriction aspect. So a significantly low body weight. And that significantly lower body weight has to be present in order for someone to be diagnosed with anorexia. They also have to have an intense fear of weight gain and be engaging in repeated behaviors to interfere with weight gain. This can be everything from taking diet pills to excessive exercise. As we saw in the video clip that we watched just barely, exercising even when hurt or sick or injured. So excessive exercise, it can be the use of laxatives or other methods to avoid weight gain. People with anorexia also tend to have a disturbed body image. When they look at themselves in the mirror, they don't see what everyone else sees. So they might see parts of them as being grotesquely fat, when the rest of us are seeing that they're grotesquely skinny and wasting away. So they have this distorted body image. And although they can tell you exactly how much they weigh usually, they don't see themselves accurately. And with that body image being disturbed, where's I going with that? They don't see themselves accurately. Oh, and we're going to see in a minute, their ideal for how they want to look is also very disturbed. They don't see themselves the way the rest of the world sees them. Okay. Excuse me. So weight loss is typically achieved through dieting, through restrictive behaviors. Quite often, people who have anorexia will have categories of food that become taboo or things that they can't eat. So like desserts. I had a client who, or like specific foods that they're like, oh, I can go without this. And it almost becomes a challenge to continue to go without that food for some individuals with anorexia nervosa. I had one client who, in his eating disorder, he wouldn't eat anything that had fat. And so he wouldn't eat even bananas because they had too much fat in them. So he would only eat very selective foods. They also tend to fear weight gain. Even when they've become skinny or have lost weight, they're still fearing that they're going to gain weight. People with anorexia nervosa, even when emaciated, they believe they are overweight. They overestimate their body size. So your weight and your size aren't always perfectly correlated, right? They go together, but not perfectly. So, for example, in my own life, I gained a lot of weight when my wife was being treated for cancer and I was taking care of the kids and the house and trying to keep up with work and all that. That year, I ended up being the heaviest I've ever been in my entire life. After that, I decided to lose the weight and get back in shape, and I started lifting weights harder than I'd ever lifted weights before, and actually found out that I really enjoy weightlifting, which with the coronavirus was really sad when they closed down the gym. So anyway, I got into lifting weights, and I gained quite a bit of muscle, more than I had before, and so my weight and my body shape weren't correlating like they used to before in my life, and I realized that I was weighing more, but my pants were much looser than before, and that goes with the muscle tone, right? So that mismatch between the number on the scale and what their actual body size is a hallmark of people who have anorexia nervosa, and they see themselves as much larger than they actually are. Also, if they can choose an ideal body image, they'll choose a much thinner body image than other people do. So let's go ahead and see the research on this, because this is a really fascinating thing. But before we go that, just real quick, the way we give modifiers to how severe anorexia is when we diagnose it, and the modifiers are either mild, moderate, or severe, and that's based on their BMI. So if the BMI is less than 17, that's when is in between 17 and 18.5, that's when we call it mild. If we're down into the 16 to 17 range, that's moderate. 15 to 16 basically is severe, and anything below 15 is extreme for the modifiers for the eating for anorexia nervosa. Also, one real quick thing that I want to mention, the name anorexia nervosa, if you look at the root of the word, would mean someone who's lost their interest in food, their appetite due to their emotional state or what's going on in their lives. People who have anorexia nervosa actually don't lose their interest in eating and food. In a lot of ways, it intensifies. So I'm thinking of a good friend of mine from years ago who has anorexia. And she and her husband have since divorced, but at the time, he was quite overweight, and that kind of goes actually with the anorexia nervosa because she loved cooking. She would cook high-fat, indulgent foods and cook a lot of it and feed them to her husband and not eat herself. So that's actually a fairly common pattern in people who have anorexia nervosa, is the focus on food almost becomes obsessive and consumes their lives in many ways. All right. So what these two images are people who have an eating disorder and people who don't have an eating disorder. Now, actually what they did is this was on people, they used a rating scale. You can see it on page 329 of your textbook, where these individuals have distorted attitudes towards eating and these individuals don't. So that distorted attitude towards eating is a hallmark of the eating disorders, but not enough to just that someone who has distorted attitudes necessarily has an eating disorder. Anyway, if we take a person who has distorted attitudes towards eating, and we look at their current weight, this is where they are, right here on this scale. If we went to where other people would find that person attractive, this is where other people would manipulate the body to make them attractive. This is where they would manipulate the body to say they're attractive, but this is their ideal. Isn't that disturbing that it's not even necessarily about being attractive? The ideal is way thinner than even finding someone attractive, right? Where if we take women who don't score high on that and who score lower on this is what we get with women who presumably would not have eating disorders, right? This is where the body currently is. This is where others would find them attractive. This is where they find it attractive. And this is the ideal. Notice how close the ideal is. It's sad that it's a little bit lower, but it's much more normal, right? So very distorted body image when it comes to, and a desire for a distorted body image. Here's a chart for BMIs, right? You can look at this in your book. One big caveat with this, and I'm trying to remember if I already mentioned this because I started to record this video, but I had to restart, so I'm not sure if I mentioned this. If I already mentioned this, forgive me. BMI is not a perfect predictor over if someone's underweight or overweight. I think I did mention it this time. I have a son who's hitting that awkward teenage growth phase where he is very tall and very gangly and hasn't gained weight really, but he's gained a lot of height. And his body mass index would be below normal, but he is not underweight because he is healthy. It's just that, and he's eating just fine. It's just because he's going through that quick early teenager rapid growth phase of his life. And there are also people who have body mass index that would be in this overweight category, but they're in that category because they have so much muscle from working out. Doesn't mean that they are overweight. They can be healthy. So BMI gives us a good idea as to where someone is, but you have to take into account other factors to understand if they're truly healthy or not. Now with anorexia nervosa, we divide people into two subgroups. We have the restricting type. These are people who are severely limiting their intake of food. And we have the binge eating purging type. And these are people who regularly engage in binge eating and then purging. A common pattern in people who have anorexia nervosa is that someone will start off as a restricting type, and later in their lives they'll end up being the binge eating purging type. And you can just see that psychologically it would be very difficult to maintain just a restricting type. So a lot of people end up being the binge eating purging type later in life. If we look at the outcomes long term, they're really not that different for someone with a restricting type versus binge eating type. So there's questions as to if we should really be dividing these into subtypes, but we currently do. Okay, So if we look at anorexia nervosa, the prevalence, it usually begins in the early to middle teenage years. In a lot of the example videos that you can find online, the person will start sometimes even younger, as early as age 10, but frequently early to middle teenage years. If someone's at the end of their teenage years, it's not as common for them to develop an eating disorder at that point, and not as common to develop anorexia, especially. Maybe one of the other eating disorders, but not as common for anorexia. Usually what begins anorexia is it's usually triggered by a combination of trying to lose weight, so dieting, in combination with a stressful life. And if you mix that with certain personality traits like perfectionism, you can end up with an eating disorder, right? And one of the big problems with anorexia nervosa is how people respond to someone losing weight. So I have a niece, and she is an amazing person. And she doesn't have an eating disorder, but when she was, 14, 15, 16-ish, she has some pretty severe health problems, and one of the medications they were trying for a while was a steroid. And if you understand how steroids work, she gained weight when she was taking the steroid. And she got to the point where she was definitely in the overweight category because of the medication. Well, they then tried a different medication because her health problems weren't going well and weren't being controlled the way the doctor wanted them to. And this next medication had the opposite effect. And so she went from being overweight to losing a lot of weight very rapidly. Now, what happens to a teenage girl? I think she was about 17 to 18 when she lost all the weight because of the switch of medication, when you lose that much weight. Well, my niece has always been beautiful, and she still is beautiful. She's just a beautiful person in personality, but also just physically. She is a pretty girl, right? And she dropped a ton of weight really fast, and everyone started complimenting her, telling her how cute she was, how pretty she was, all these different things. So you can see how someone at the beginning, when they're developing an eating disorder, how they are reinforced for it socially. So not only are they reinforced because they're seeing the number on the scale go down and they're able to wear skinnier clothes and all these different things, but then society starts telling them, you're worthwhile, you're doing well, and it can lead to this really, really dangerous pattern. Eating disorders are 3 times more prevalent in women than men. We also, just rate-wise, it's a little bit less than 1% of the population has anorexia nervosa. Excuse me. Anorexia nervosa is very comorbid with other disorders, so we see a high rate of depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, phobias, panic, and personality disorders when someone has anorexia nervosa. Also, when someone has anorexia, one of the big risks for them is suicide. We see that about 20% of people who have anorexia will have at least one suicide attempt in their life, which is much higher than the rest of the population. People who have anorexia are 6 more times likely to end their life by suicide than people in the general population. We also see a high degree of self-harm behaviors, so things like cutting at the wrists and things like that. We see about 25% of people who have anorexia are engaging in some self-harm type behavior. So, because someone with anorexia nervosa is keeping their body weight so low, there are health consequences that come with that. So among these are things like low blood pressure, heart rate decreases, kidney and gastrointestinal problems, a lot of constipation and things along those lines, because the gastrointestinal system shuts down. Loss of bone mass, we see lanugo, which is growing of hair all over the body to try to keep warm, is the theory. Infants are born with that, but then it goes away. But people who have anorexia start to grow hair. Brittle nails, dry skin, hair loss, low levels of sodium and potassium in their blood, which can lead them to be tired and weak and can lead to cardiac failure and death, right? So this is one of the most deadly of the psychological disorders, not just because of the high suicide rate, but because the problems with self-starvation, right? If you starve yourself enough, your body will die young. And we do see a decrease in life expectancy in this disorder. So even individuals who don't die from starvation young, they're doing permanent damage to their bodies. So yeah, we can see this in any place where there's severe restriction. It leads to osteoporosis, brittle bones, all sorts of problems. Okay. If we look at the prognosis, there's hope, right? There's a good chance that someone who goes into treatment and works at it will recover. 50 to 70% of people who have anorexia will eventually recover. However, this is why this disorder can be a little disheartening, is for most people that's a very long treatment process to get to recovery. So may often take 6 to 7 years for someone to get fully recovered. So it's a very long process, and relapse is very high in eating disorders. So it's something that someone really needs to be mindful about their entire lives. There's a video that I was debating if I was going to show you or not, and I decided not to, but one of the things historically, when someone would come into the hospital and they had an eating disorder, the therapist would work with them to gradually get them eating more. Today, what we know from research now is that every day, every week that someone's living at a very underweight place where they're restricting their food and hurting themselves this way is having major health consequences long term. Permanent heart damage, permanent bone damage, all these things that are so bad for someone's future. And so now hospital treatment programs aren't as gentle in their approach, and the first goal is to get someone's weight up. And that's success. We need to get their weight up as quick as possible. However, people who have anorexia nervosa, their body might return to a normal weight, but their thought patterns and how they're living in their mind doesn't return to normal without extensive treatment. Like I said, it can take quite a while to get someone there. So with that, someone who's gained weight at the hospital and they're doing well and they're eating and they go home, quite often what happens with this relapse pattern is like, well, I just like to be 10 pounds less. So they'll add in one of their old behaviors that was restricting in some way, shape, or form. And it's a slippery slope. So the video I was thinking about showing you, this girl talks about how after she left the hospital, she started by just restricting just one day. So she was eating 6 days a week and only restricting 1 day a week. And then she was restricting 2 days a week and then 3 days a week. And you can see it's kind of a slippery slope. Okay, so it's very difficult to modify the distorted view of the self, especially in cultures that value thinness. It was really surprising to me to see how much attention my niece started to get as she lost weight. And I know this happens, but it was really stark the extent of how it happened and to what extent it happened. So it's very difficult to get that to change in cultures that value people's body size a lot more than we frequently value them as people. Okay, so I mentioned that the suicide rate earlier was 6 times higher for someone to complete suicide. If we just look at the overall death rates for people with anorexia nervosa are 10 times higher than the general population. So it's a very dangerous illness. Death rate 2 times higher than other psychological disorders. So the psychological disorders, this is the most dangerous one. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go on to bulimia nervosa. All right. So in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, some of the criteria for having bulimia nervosa is first having recurrent episodes of binge eating. So what is binge eating? This is when someone is eating a lot of food, usually high-calorie, forbidden, unhealthy foods, and they're forbidden not really, but to the person in their mind, they're forbidden foods. They eat large quantities in a very short amount of time, usually under 2 hours. So someone who's binging will frequently eat large amounts of ice cream and cake and cookies and things of that nature at a very high rate. One of my clients who had bulimia nervosa would hit like 5 different fast food places all within a couple hours and eat a lot from each, like a full meal from each fast food place. But so usually very unhealthy types of food. Now that's one aspect of it, but then you have the binge, but then you during the binge, the person reports feeling out of control. Binges are frequently triggered by stressful events, very emotional stressful events frequently. But then the thing with bulimia nervosa is it's followed by a compensatory behavior. If it's not followed by a compensatory behavior, it's binge eating disorder, which we get to next. So there's a compensatory behavior, meaning some way to try to get rid of the calories and the food. This can be an excessive exercise. This can be for fasting for multiple days after. This could be the use of laxatives or diuretics to try to get rid of the food. The one that most people think of, though, is vomiting. So throwing up, purging to get rid of that. Body shape and weight are extremely important to people's self-evaluation. So again, their self-concept and their self-worth is very much tied to their look. Now, people who have bulimia nervosa, if they're severely underweight, actually don't have bulimia nervosa, right? They have anorexia, okay? Someone who has bulimia nervosa is of normal or above average weight even. Okay, come on slides, go to the next one. So we differentiate mild, moderate, severe, and extreme bulimia nervosa based on how many times the person is engaging in compensatory behaviors per week. So 1 to 3 compensatory behaviors, that's mild. 4 to 7, that's moderate. Excuse me, I'm having some acid reflux today. That's not pleasant. Anyway, 4 to 7 moderate, 8 to 13 severe, 14 or more is extreme. Okay, so binge episode includes an excessive amount of food consumed in a short period of time and a loss of control over eating. Typically, most binges occur in secret. So if someone's eating a ton of food in a food eating contest, or they're eating a ton at Thanksgiving dinner, that's not the type of binge that we're talking about in bulimia nervosa. When someone has bulimia, they're usually quite ashamed of their binges, and so they try to hide their binges. Maybe it's triggered by stress, negative emotions, or negative social interactions. Typical foods, we already talked about that, high calorie foods that they have forbidden in their mind. One of the things that predicts if someone's going to binge is if they've actually been restricting themselves from certain foods. So someone's like, to get healthy, I'm not going to eat any bread, any carbohydrate whatsoever, right? And then they break down, they binge, especially on that unhealthy food. I won't eat any ice cream, and then they eat a whole quart after. So food restrictions predict binges. So avoiding a crave food can later increase the likelihood of a binge. Reports of losing awareness or dissociation do occur sometimes with bulimia nervosa. Someone doesn't feel like they're themselves even, or don't remember it very well. And then there's a lot of shame and remorse and guilt that tends to follow. Compensatory behavior, remember, it has to have the binge, but also has to have the compensatory behavior to be bulimia. So let's get a little more in depth on that compensatory behavior. First is feelings of discomfort, disgust, and fear of weight gain lead to inappropriate compensatory behavior. So we socially kind of endorse some of these, right? So we have a National Binge Day, Thanksgiving, followed by the turkey trot. You go run, or you go do something the day after burn classes at the gym, whatever. That's kind of a societal accepted practice, but that's kind of what this is someone feels discomfort, they feel disgust. It's much more intense than someone's going to have with Thanksgiving, right? They're afraid they're going to gain weight, so that leads to inappropriate compensatory behaviors to try to undo the caloric effects of the binge. And we've already talked about those different methods that people tend to use. Now, in order to be considered bulimia nervosa, someone has to be having this happen on a weekly basis for at least 3 months. If it's less than that, we're not going to classify as bulimia nervosa yet, although they can definitely have an eating disorder not otherwise specified, suggesting that they're leading towards this full diagnosis. Onset is in late adolescence or early adulthood, so the onset for bulimia nervosa tends to be a little bit later than that of anorexia nervosa. 90% of people who have bulimia nervosa are female. However, that might be because it's underdiagnosed in men. Because we so much think of eating disorder as a female problem, there may be multiple men out there people who have eating disorders, but their doctors are missing the symptoms of it, and their families are missing the symptoms of it because we don't think of men as having bulimia or eating disorders, right? If we're looking at the prevalence of bulimia nervosa in the general population, it's 1 to 2% of the population. Typically overweight before onset of symptoms. Usually bulimia nervosa begins with dieting. People will try and use this horrible pattern is taught so much in our society. I mean, just look at Oprah, for example, throughout the years. Actually, I'm going to see if I can find a video of this. Give me just a second. All right, I tried to find a video of Oprah over the years, but this is such a common societal pattern that so many people have done that I just wanted to emphasize it because this is what frequently leads to the beginning of eating disorders, especially bulimia nervosa. So these are both pictures of Oprah, and we can see that she has significantly different weights during this. And if you listen to Oprah over the years, she's done many, many different things to lose weight. And so when we look at the beginning of eating disorders, typically people, before they develop an eating disorder, are doing something like Oprah's doing. They tend to be overweight, and I'm not saying that Oprah has an eating disorder. She might not, I don't know. But anyway, they tend to be overweight, and then they'll start to diet. And that restriction tends to lead to the first binge, and then that person does some compensatory behavior, some purging, some exercise, whatever, to get rid of those calories. And they go, oh, look, I didn't ruin my diet. I didn't ruin things. I could just throw it up. I could just take a laxative, whatever. And they start this very horrible pattern that can really hurt people's lives. Bulimia nervosa is very comorbid with depression, personality disorders, anxiety, substance use disorders, and conduct disorders. The depression is hard to know, though, if it's which comes first. It's kind of a chicken and the egg scenario, because with a lot of people, the depressive symptoms are already present and then they develop the bulimia, but they are highly comorbid. Suicide rates are higher than the general population, but not to the extent that we see with anorexia nervosa. Okay. Physical complications. Potassium depletion, which can lead to fatigue, is a very common one. And this is sometimes how someone is diagnosed, or a doctor catches on that someone is having bulimia, is because of the potassium. Laxative use depletes electrolytes, which can cause cardiac irregularities, so heart arrhythmias, weird patterns of heartbeats, all those different things. Vomiting may lead to tears in the tissues of the stomach and of the throat. It can lead to inflamed glands. So sometimes what we'll see in someone who has bulimia nervosa is what we call the moon face, because the glands are swelling, and so the bottom of the chin will round out, giving them an even pudgier look. So a lot of these times these people are really worried about their physical appearance, and they'll actually look heavier because the glands will be swollen, right? Okay, because of the irritation from the throwing up. With bulimia nervosa, we also get loss of dental enamel when people who are purging from the stomach acid from vomiting. Mortality rate higher than other disorders, not as high as anorexia nervosa. Okay, so if we're looking at the prognosis, around 75 or 3/4 of cases tend to recover. However, 10 to 20% of cases tend to remain fully symptomatic. So it can be quite a persistent disorder for some individuals. However, with most disorders just in general, and this holds true for bulimia nervosa, early intervention comes with improved outcomes. The earlier we catch it, the earlier we treat it, the better people do. So if you have someone who's starting to engage in these type of behaviors, you nip it in the bud. I have another person that, this wasn't a client, this was a friend, a loved one, who was starting to engage in these behaviors. And I talked to him, we're like, no, we're going to nip this in the bud, we're going to address this very quickly, because the earlier we catch it, the earlier we get it addressed, the better people do. So the biggest key difference between bulimia and anorexia is that people with anorexia are underweight, people with bulimia aren't. People with anorexia nervosa lose a tremendous amount of weight, people with bulimia nervosa do not. And that weight loss isn't necessarily anorexia. So for example, remember, anorexia tends to start younger. So what we're seeing now is a lot of people, even prepubescent children, are developing anorexia as the pressure to be thin is pushed on younger and younger kids. And in those cases, it can be a failure to gain weight. So my son right now definitely does not have an eating disorder in any way, shape, or form. I mentioned him a couple times in this video. Tall, gangly, getting stretched out because he's hit that awkward growth spurt for him where he's super skinny and super tall, okay? If he started to gain weight, which happened next, because he's had his growth spurt, he should start putting on some weight, right? Or he's having his growth spurt. But anyway, he should start filling out, right? I bought him extra skinny jeans the other day that were long enough, and he pulled them to the side, and it's like he could fit another person in there. It was crazy, right? He should start filling out those jeans, right? Now, with that being the case, of that being the normal pattern, what happens a lot with females who have an eating disorder is they refuse to get that normal weight gain that comes with puberty. So it can be weight loss, but it can also be the refusal to have your body go through that normal weight gain that it does during puberty. Okay. All right, let's move on to binge eating disorder. All right, so with binge eating disorder, what you have is someone who is binging, but they're not doing the compensatory behaviors. They're not using laxatives, they're not purging, they're not exercising, they're not fasting after, they just binge, right? So it makes sense that with binge eating disorder, one of the most common things we see is that people are very obese, right? So during a binge, somewhat similar to what we see in bulimia nervosa, people eat faster than usual, they eat more than usual, they eat past being full. So it's no longer about eating because you're hungry. Eat large amounts even when not hungry. Eating alone due to embarrassment about the large quantity of food that someone's eating. They also report feeling bad. They feel disgusted with themselves, they feel guilty afterwards, they feel depressed after the binge. Okay, so recurring binge episodes at least once a week for 3 months. No compensatory behaviors present. 1 to 3 a week for mild, 4 to 7 for moderate, 18 to 13 for severe, 14 or more per week for extreme. Associated with obesity and history of dieting. So frequently people who have binge eating disorder have a BMI over 30, right? And so with that, everything that comes with obesity, someone being overweight, is comorbid with binge eating disorder. Also, people who have binge eating disorder frequently have higher rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct disorder, and substance abuse. So if we look at the rate of binge eating disorder, well, let's look at the risk factors first, sorry. If we look at the risk factors for binge eating disorder, childhood obesity, critical comments about being overweight, weight loss attempts in childhood, low self-concept, depression, and childhood physical or sexual abuse are all risk factors for developing binge eating disorder. It's more prevalent in women than men again. However, the difference between women and men isn't as great as the other disorders. So in bulimia, we're talking 90%. And in anorexia, it's about 3 times. If we look at the rates for men versus women in binge eating disorder, the rates for men versus women here, and I pulled this up to show you just so you can see how vastly the rates vary, there's such a big window because we haven't recognized binge eating disorder as its own disorder for as long as we have anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. So right here, between 0.2 and 3.5% of females will have binge eating disorder, and 0.9 and 2% of males will develop binge eating disorder. Excuse me. And that's from, let's see, Stice and Behan 2012. Okay, so I just wanted to pull that up so you can see how wide the windows are. So we know that more women than men. We don't think the gap is as big as it was for binge, for bulimia nervosa and anorexia nervosa, but there is less of a gender difference. Okay. More prevalent than anorexia or bulimia, equally prevalent among Euro, African, Asian, and Hispanic Americans. All right, binge eating disorder, increased risk of type 2 diabetes. This is where I said anything that comes with obesity obviously is going to come with binge eating disorder. So type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic back pain, headaches, all common. Also sleep problems like sleep apnea, anxiety, depression, irritable bowel syndrome, early onset of menstruation in women. So one of the big contributors to early puberty is being overweight, right? So it's a relatively new diagnosis, so the rates of recovery vary greatly depending on what study you read. Anywhere from 25% to 82% recover. So that's really hard to say how long-term and how difficult this one is to treat, because it's just such a new diagnosis that we don't know it as well. One research suggested that the duration of the disorder is on average 4 years. So binge eating disorder versus anorexia and bulimia. Binge eating disorder, absence of weight loss, and binge eating disorder, you get the weight gain, right? Binge eating disorder versus bulimia nervosa, no compensatory behavior. All right. So let me just pull up your class activity and we'll finish this first video. All right, here's activity 1. So what you can do for your first activity is read the Focus on Discovery box 11.1. It starts on page 333 of your textbook. And then what you can do is then in your discussion write down 3 things that you learned from this box, and then give 1 idea on how we can address the obesity epidemic that this box doesn't give you. So think about something, come up with something. You can find something on the internet or find a scholarly article on how we can address the obesity epidemic. So that is 11.1, activity 1, and your first video for this chapter. If you're looking and following along in the slides, we actually covered slides 1 through 37 in this first video, so we're there are 71 slides. We're a little more than halfway actually through this chapter just with this first video. So don't worry, I know it's a longer video, but the other ones shouldn't be quite so long as this one. Let me know if you have any questions and have a great day. Bye.